The shopping mall was packed with people, the buzz of conversation, and the hum of activity filling the air. 10-year-old Ava walked into the toy store, her eyes lighting up as she saw the shelves filled with colorful boxes and shiny gadgets. She had always loved looking at toys, imagining the adventures she could have with them. Her small hands touched a stuffed animal on a shelf, her fingers running across the soft fabric. She wasn't thinking about anything else, just enjoying the moment, her curiosity taking over as she wandered through the aisles. Ava wasn't alone in the store, but she felt like she was in her own little world. Unbeknownst to her, one of the store employees had been watching her for a while. The employee, a middle-aged man with a stern face, didn't like how long Ava had been lingering near the shelves. To him, it seemed suspicious. He noticed her touching a few items, and then putting them back, her small backpack swinging on her back. His frown deepened, and he muttered something to his colleague before walking to the phone by the counter. The store employee dialed mall security, explaining in a hushed tone that a young girl had been acting suspiciously. He didn't know for sure, but he had noticed a toy missing from one of the shelves Ava had been standing near. Instead of confronting her directly, he decided it was better to let security handle it. Ava had no idea any of this was happening. She was now looking at a row of dolls, her wide eyes filled with fascination. Minutes later, a police officer entered the store. Officer Daniels had a reputation for being strict and thorough. She walked with confidence, her uniform sharp, and her badge gleaming. The employee quickly pointed Ava out to her, whispering details about his suspicions. Officer Daniels nodded and walked toward Ava, who was still unaware of the situation. The moment the officer approached, Ava turned around, startled. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the tall woman in a police uniform standing in front of her. "Excuse me, young lady," Officer Daniels said, her voice firm but not loud. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Ava's eyes widened, and she stammered, I'm just looking at the toys." The officer glanced at her backpack and then back at her face. "Do you have anything in your bag that you didn't pay for?" she asked, her tone growing sharper. Ava froze, confused by the question. She clutched her backpack tightly, shaking her head. "No, I don't. I didn't take anything," she said, her voice trembling. By now, a few shoppers had noticed the interaction and started watching from a distance. Whispers began to spread. Some looked concerned, while others seemed curious. The tension in the air grew heavier as Officer Daniels pressed further. "We've had a report about a missing item," the officer said. "I'm going to need you to open your bag." Ava's hands shook as she unzipped her backpack. Inside were only her schoolbooks and a water bottle. She looked up at the officer, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't take anything," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Daniels didn't seem convinced. She glanced at the employee, who shrugged but didn't back down from his claim. The officer crossed her arms and said, "Stay right here." She radioed for backup, asking for someone to review the store's surveillance footage. Ava stood there, frozen, feeling the weight of all the stares on her. She wanted to disappear, her small body trembling with fear and embarrassment. A woman standing nearby with her child frowned and whispered to her husband, "She's just a kid. This doesn't seem right." But no one stepped forward to intervene. Ava's heart pounded as she looked around, hoping to find someone to help her. Finally, with a shaky voice, she said, "Can I call my dad? Please, he'll tell you I didn't do anything." Officer Daniels hesitated for a moment before nodding. She handed Ava her phone, watching her closely as she dialed the number. Ava's father, James Carter, was just finishing up his coffee at a nearby cafe when he received the call. The panic in Ava's voice made him drop everything and rush to the toy store. James was a tall, confident man with a kind face, but at that moment, his expression was filled with worry and anger. He arrived at the store in minutes, his eyes immediately finding his daughter standing alone in front of the officer. "What's going on here?" James demanded, his deep voice cutting through the murmur of the growing crowd. He walked straight to Ava, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Ava clung to him, her small hands gripping his arm tightly. Officer Daniels explained the situation, her tone neutral but firm. James listened, his jaw tightening as she spoke. When she finished, he looked directly at her and said, "You're accusing my daughter of something she didn't do without any proof. I want to see the surveillance footage right now." The crowd around them grew larger, the tension in the air so thick it was almost unbearable. James stood tall, his presence commanding, as he prepared to defend his daughter against the unfair accusations. Ava, though still scared, felt a glimmer of hope now that her father was there by her side. James stood protectively by Ava's side, his presence giving her a sense of safety she hadn't felt moments ago. The officer's confident stance faltered slightly as she looked up at him. His calm yet firm demeanor demanded respect, but the tension in the room was still thick. Shoppers who had stopped to watch the scene remained silent, their curiosity keeping them rooted in place. Ava clung to her father's arm, her face buried against his sleeve, her tears leaving damp spots on his shirt. "I'm not leaving until we clear this up," James said, his voice steady but laced with controlled anger. "You've accused my daughter of theft, but where is your evidence? Show me something concrete, or this conversation ends now." Officer Daniels hesitated, looking over at the store employee who had made the initial call. The man shuffled nervously, avoiding James's intense gaze. "Well," the employee stammered, "we noticed a toy missing from one of the shelves she was near. She's been walking around for a while. It just seemed suspicious." "Suspicion isn't proof," James snapped back, his voice rising slightly but still measured. "If my daughter is innocent, this situation is unacceptable. You've humiliated her in front of all these people for no reason." The officer held up a hand, trying to regain control of the situation. "We're reviewing the surveillance footage now, Mr. Carter. If the footage clears your daughter, then we'll settle this matter immediately." James nodded, his jaw clenched, his dark eyes fixed on the officer. "Good. And if it doesn't clear her, then I'll be the first to apologize. But until then, you owe her the benefit of the doubt." Ava peeked out from behind her father, her tear-streaked face watching the officer and the employee closely. Her small voice broke the silence. "Daddy, I didn't do anything. I swear." James looked down at her, his expression softening for a moment as he gently patted her shoulder. "I know, sweetheart. I believe you." The minutes stretched endlessly as everyone waited for news from the security room. Meanwhile, whispers floated through the crowd. Some murmured about the unfairness of the situation, while others speculated about what the footage might show. James heard snippets of the comments, but kept his focus on Ava, who hadn't let go of his arm. A young woman with a stroller standing nearby spoke up hesitantly, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Excuse me, but I've been here for a while. I saw the little girl looking at toys, but I didn't see her take anything." Her words caused a ripple in the crowd, and James turned toward her, his expression softening slightly in gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. Officer Daniels glanced at the woman and then at James, her professionalism slipping for a moment as doubt flickered across her face. "We'll have confirmation soon," she said firmly, though the confidence in her voice wavered slightly. Just then, another officer arrived from the security room, holding a tablet with the footage queued up. Officer Daniels quickly reviewed the video, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the screen. The crowd fell silent, the anticipation thick in the air. James watched her intently, his arms crossed, his protective stance unyielding. After a few moments, Officer Daniels exhaled sharply and handed the tablet to James. "Here's the footage," she said, her tone clipped but professional. James leaned in, Ava standing on her tiptoes to see as well. The video showed Ava walking through the aisles, touching a few items, but never putting anything in her bag. Her movements were innocent, nothing out of the ordinary for a curious child. James straightened up, his expression both relieved and furious. "There, you see. My daughter didn't take anything. This was all based on an assumption, a wrong one." The store employee looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot. I thought I saw something," he mumbled, avoiding James's gaze. "You didn't think hard enough," James shot back. "Instead, you put my daughter through this unnecessary ordeal. Do you realize how humiliating this has been for her?" Officer Daniels cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for the misunderstanding. We take these reports seriously, but it's clear now that your daughter is innocent." James wasn't ready to let it go just yet. "An apology isn't enough. You accused a child without evidence, and you scared her in the process. I'll be filing a formal complaint against both you and this store for how this was handled." The crowd, which had grown over time, now murmured in agreement. Some nodded, others clapped softly in support. Ava, still holding onto her father's arm, looked up at him with admiration. For the first time since the incident began, she felt a spark of hope and pride. As the officer and the store employee tried to salvage what was left of their authority, James guided Ava out of the store. The crowd parted for them, offering sympathetic smiles and supportive words as they passed. Ava wiped her eyes, her small hand gripping her father's tightly. Outside the store, James knelt down to her level, his expression softening completely. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice gentle. Ava nodded, her tears finally drying. "I'm okay, Daddy. Thank you for believing in me." James smiled, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "I'll always believe in you. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small, okay?" Ava nodded again, her heart swelling with love and gratitude for her father. The incident had shaken her, but she knew one thing for certain: her father would always have her back, no matter what. As James and Ava stepped out of the store, the tension still lingered in the air. Ava clung tightly to her father's hand, her little fingers curling into his palm, as if letting go would mean losing the security she had finally found. The sun outside felt warmer, brighter, as if trying to offer comfort after the storm they had just endured. But James's mind was anything but calm. His heart ached for his daughter and the injustice she had faced, and his anger simmered just beneath the surface. James crouched down beside Ava, gently placing his hands on her shoulders. His voice softened, though his determination remained steady. "Listen to me, sweetheart. What happened back there wasn't your fault. You did nothing wrong, okay? Don't let anyone make you feel bad about yourself." Ava nodded, her big tearful eyes searching his face for reassurance. "I promise, Daddy," she whispered, her voice shaky but sincere. James gave her a small smile and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Good. Now, let's go home. We'll talk about this more later, but for now, let's just take a deep breath and leave it behind us." As they began walking toward the car, Ava glanced back at the store, her small face marked with a mix of sadness and curiosity. The scene inside was still vivid in her mind. The accusatory looks, the embarrassment of being questioned in front of strangers, and the overwhelming fear that no one would believe her. But she also remembered her father's unwavering support and how he had stood up for her, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. James opened the car door and helped Ava into her seat, buckling her in with care. As he slid into the driver's seat, he took a moment to compose himself. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He let out a slow breath, trying to push the anger down. "You okay back there?" he asked, glancing at Ava through the rearview mirror. "I think so," Ava replied quietly. "But Daddy, why did they think I stole something? I didn't do anything." James's heart twisted at her words. He wanted to protect her from the harsh realities of the world, but he knew he couldn't shield her from everything. "Sometimes people make assumptions," he began carefully, choosing his words. "And sometimes those assumptions aren't fair. But what matters is that we stood up for the truth, and we proved them wrong. You're brave, Ava. Don't forget that." Ava's small nod made his chest ache with pride and sadness all at once. She was just a child, too young to face such harsh treatment. But James knew this wouldn't be the last time she encountered challenges. All he could do was prepare her to face them with strength and resilience. When they got home, Ava ran straight to her room, grabbing her favorite stuffed animal for comfort. James watched her go, his heart heavy. He sat on the couch, his mind racing. The incident at the store replayed in his head over and over. The embarrassment, the fear in Ava's eyes, the crowd of strangers who had watched without stepping in. It made his blood boil. He pulled out his phone, determined to take action. This wasn't something he could just let go of. He searched for the store's customer service number and dialed it, his jaw tight as the phone rang. A customer service representative picked up, their cheerful tone only irritating James further. "Hello, this is James Carter," he began, his voice firm but controlled. "I was in your store earlier today, and my daughter was wrongly accused of theft by your staff. I want to file a formal complaint about how this was handled." The representative hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard. "I'm very sorry to hear that, Mr. Carter. Can you tell me more about what happened?" James recounted the events, leaving no detail unspoken. He described how the employee had accused Ava without evidence, how the officer had escalated the situation, and how the entire ordeal had humiliated his daughter. The representative apologized profusely, promising to escalate the issue to the store manager and ensure proper action was taken. After ending the call, James leaned back on the couch, his mind still racing. He wasn't done yet. He opened his laptop and began typing out a detailed email to the store's corporate office. He wanted to ensure that this incident wouldn't be swept under the rug. His daughter deserved justice, and he wasn't going to stop until he got it. Meanwhile, Ava sat on her bed, hugging her stuffed animal tightly. Her mind wandered back to the store, to the woman who had spoken up for her, and to the crowd that had eventually clapped in support. It was a confusing mix of emotions: fear, embarrassment, and a small spark of gratitude. She didn't fully understand what had happened, but she knew one thing for sure: her father had been her hero. Later that evening, James sat down with Ava, pulling her into a comforting hug. "How are you feeling now, sweetie?" he asked gently. "Better," Ava said softly. "But Daddy, will they do this to someone else?" James's expression hardened. "Not if I can help it," he said firmly. "We're going to make sure they learn from this. No one else should have to go through what you did." Ava looked up at him, her small face filled with admiration. "Thank you, Daddy." James smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Always, sweetheart. Always." The next morning, James woke up earlier than usual. The events of the previous day still weighed heavily on his mind. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring out the window, his thoughts racing. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was determined. His little girl had been humiliated, and he needed to make sure no one else experienced what Ava had gone through. As he sipped his coffee, he started forming a plan in his head. Ava woke up a little later, her footsteps light as she walked into the kitchen. She still looked a bit hesitant, as if unsure how to feel about everything that had happened. James smiled warmly at her, pushing away his own worries for the moment. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said. "Did you sleep well?" Ava shrugged, hugging her stuffed animal. "A little," she admitted. "I kept thinking about the store." James's heart ached for her. He reached out and gently ruffled her hair. "It's okay to think about it, Ava. It's okay to feel upset. But remember, we're going to make this right." Ava nodded, but she still looked unsure. James decided it was time to take action, not just for Ava, but to ensure the store and its staff learned a valuable lesson. After breakfast, he told Ava to get dressed and grabbed his laptop. While she was in her room, he sent another email, this time to a local news outlet. He detailed the incident, explaining how his daughter had been wrongly accused and how the situation had escalated unfairly. He included his contact information and pressed send. James knew it was a bold step, but he also knew that silence wouldn't help anyone. If the story got attention, It could spark a larger conversation about how people, especially children, were treated in such situations. He didn't just want an apology. He wanted accountability. When Ava came back into the kitchen, James was ready to shift gears. He smiled and said, "How about we do something fun today? Just the two of us." Ava's eyes lit up a little, though she still seemed cautious. "Like what?" "Anything you want," James said. "We could go to the park, get ice cream, or even visit the library if you feel like reading." Ava thought for a moment and then smiled. "Ice cream sounds good," she said softly. James chuckled. "Ice cream it is." As they drove to the ice cream shop, James noticed Ava seemed a bit more at ease. She was looking out the window, humming softly to herself. It was a small relief to see her starting to bounce back, even if the memory of the incident lingered. At the shop, they picked out their favorite flavors and sat outside on a bench, enjoying the sunny day. James used the moment to subtly check in with Ava. "How are you feeling now?" he asked gently. "I think I'm okay," Ava said between bites of ice cream. "But I still feel weird about what happened." James nodded, understanding completely. "That's normal, Ava. What happened wasn't fair, and it's okay to feel upset about it. But remember, you're stronger than what they tried to make you feel. And you're not alone in this. I'm here always." Ava smiled at him, a small but genuine smile that warmed James's heart. For a brief moment, it felt like they were putting the ordeal behind them, even if just for the afternoon. But James's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him back into reality. It was a reply to his email from the news outlet. They were interested in covering the story and wanted to set up a time for an interview. James read the message carefully, his mind racing. He wanted to protect Ava's privacy, but he also wanted her story to be heard. After a moment of thought, he decided he'd respond later, once Ava was asleep, and discuss how to move forward. Back at home, James received another call, this time from the store's manager. The voice on the other end was apologetic, almost overly so. "Mr. Carter, we've reviewed the situation, and we'd like to extend our sincerest apologies to you and your daughter. This incident does not reflect our values, and we're taking steps to ensure it doesn't happen again." James listened, his expression neutral. He appreciated the apology, but words alone weren't enough. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied calmly. "But I want to know exactly what steps you're taking. What kind of training are your employees receiving? How are you addressing the actions of the staff who were involved yesterday?" The manager hesitated, clearly unprepared for James's pointed questions. "We're still working out the details," they said vaguely. "But I assure you, we're taking this very seriously." James wasn't satisfied with the response, but he decided to leave it for now. "I'll be following up," he said firmly before ending the call. He knew this wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a start. That evening, as James tucked Ava into bed, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He kissed her forehead and whispered, "Good night, sweetheart. Tomorrow's a new day." Ava smiled sleepily, her eyes fluttering shut. "Good night, Daddy." As James left her room, he sat down at his laptop once again, ready to continue his mission. He wasn't just fighting for Ava, he was fighting for every child who had ever been unfairly judged. And he wasn't going to stop until he made a difference. The morning sun streamed through the curtains as James sat at the dining table, laptop open, staring at his inbox. The email from the local news outlet still sat there, waiting for his response. He knew he had to reply, but the weight of the decision lingered. This wasn't just about him. It was about Ava. He didn't want her to feel exposed or overwhelmed, but he also felt a responsibility to speak up. After a long moment, he sighed and started typing. He thanked the reporter for their interest and agreed to a phone interview later that day, making it clear that his daughter's identity needed to be protected. Meanwhile, Ava was in the living room, quietly drawing in her sketchbook. James had always admired her creativity. She had a way of expressing herself through art that words couldn't capture. Today, she was drawing what looked like a park scene, with kids playing and laughing. But James noticed something else, a small figure standing to the side, looking sad. His heart sank. The incident at the store was still fresh in her mind, even if she wasn't saying it out loud. James walked over and sat beside her. "That's a beautiful drawing, Ava," he said gently. "Can you tell me about it?" Ava hesitated, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. "It's just some kids playing," she said softly. "But this one." She pointed to the figure on the side. "She doesn't want to join in. She's scared they'll be mean to her." James felt a lump in his throat. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay to feel that way, sweetheart," he said. "But remember, not everyone is mean. There are good people out there too. People who care about you and want to see you happy." Ava looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Like you?" she asked. James smiled. "Exactly like me. And you're never alone, Ava. You're strong, and I'm here to remind you of that whenever you need." She nodded, her small smile returning as she went back to her drawing. James stayed beside her for a while, just watching her create. He wanted to give her the space to process everything in her own way. Later that afternoon, James took the call from the reporter. He stepped into his bedroom, closing the door behind him to ensure privacy. The reporter introduced herself and expressed her sympathy for what had happened. "Stories like this need to be told," she said. "It's important to hold people accountable and to raise awareness about these kinds of issues." James agreed, though he felt a bit nervous. He recounted the events of that day, his voice steady but firm. He made it clear that his goal wasn't to vilify the store or its employees, but to highlight the harm caused by their actions and to push for change. "This isn't just about my daughter," he said. "It's about ensuring that no other child has to go through what she went through." The reporter asked if they could publish the story and if James would be willing to appear on camera for a follow-up. James hesitated. He didn't want the focus to shift to him, but he also knew the power of putting a face to a story. "Let me think about it," he said. "For now, you can share what I've told you, but please keep my daughter's identity private." After the call ended, James sat on the edge of his bed, feeling a mix of emotions. He was proud of himself for speaking up, but he also felt the weight of what was to come. Sharing their story publicly could bring attention, but it could also bring criticism. He hoped he was making the right choice. As the day went on, James received another call, this time from the store's corporate office. A woman introduced herself as a regional manager and apologized profusely for what had happened. "We've reviewed the incident thoroughly," she said. "We want to assure you that we're taking this very seriously. The employees involved will undergo mandatory training, and we're revisiting our policies to prevent this from happening again." James listened carefully, his tone measured. "I appreciate that you're taking action," he said. "But I hope this isn't just about damage control. This needs to be a lasting change, not just for my daughter's sake, but for everyone who shops at your stores." The regional manager agreed, promising to stay in touch and provide updates. James ended the call feeling a small sense of progress, though he knew there was still a long way to go. That evening, James and Ava sat on the couch together, watching one of her favorite movies. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. For the first time in days, she seemed genuinely relaxed. James wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "Daddy," Ava said suddenly, her voice quiet. "Do you think they'll be nicer to kids like me now?" James looked down at her, his heart swelling with both love and determination. "I hope so, sweetheart," he said. "And if they're not, we'll keep standing up for what's right. Together." Ava smiled, her eyes shining with trust. "Okay." As the credits rolled, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about fighting for Ava. It was about creating a world where all children could feel safe and valued. And he wasn't going to stop until that world became a reality. The next morning, James woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. As he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, He saw countless notifications lighting up the screen. Text messages, emails, and missed calls had flooded in overnight. Confused and slightly alarmed, he opened one of the messages from his sister. "James, have you seen this? The story about Ava is everywhere. People are talking about it on social media. Call me." His heart raced as he quickly opened his social media app. The story about Ava's experience at the store had gone viral. The local news outlet had shared the article, and it was spreading rapidly. There were thousands of comments, shares, and reactions. People were outraged on Ava's behalf, demanding accountability from the store and expressing their support for the family. James felt a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, he was glad people were paying attention to what had happened. The more awareness there was, the more pressure there would be for meaningful change. On the other hand, he worried about how all this attention might affect Ava. He didn't want her to feel overwhelmed or scared by the sudden spotlight. After a few moments, he decided to shield Ava from the news for now. She was still a child, and she deserved to have some peace. James stepped into the kitchen to make breakfast, trying to act as though everything was normal. Ava came in shortly after, still in her pajamas, and sat at the table. "Good morning, Daddy," she said with a yawn. "Good morning, sweetheart," James replied with a warm smile. "How about pancakes today?" Her eyes lit up. "Yes, please." As he cooked, James couldn't help but glance at his phone every now and then. The notifications kept coming, and his inbox was filling with messages from reporters, activists, and even strangers offering their support. He knew he had to be careful about how he handled this. Later in the day, James received a call from the same reporter he had spoken to earlier. Her voice was excited but professional. "James, your story has really struck a chord with people. We'd like to do a follow-up interview. Would you and Ava be willing to share more about how you're doing and what you hope to see change?" James hesitated. He didn't want Ava to feel like she was being dragged into something she couldn't fully understand. "I appreciate the offer," he said carefully, "but I need to think about Ava's well-being first. I'll get back to you." The reporter understood, thanking him again for his courage in speaking out. After hanging up, James sat down and thought about what to do next. He didn't want to ignore the momentum the story had gained, but he also didn't want to exploit Ava's experience. He decided to call his sister for advice. "James, this is big," his sister said. "People are listening. If you handle this right, you could make a real difference. But you're right to be cautious. Ava comes first." "I just don't want her to feel like she's under a microscope," James replied. "She's been through enough." "You're a good dad, James," his sister said reassuringly. "You'll figure out the right balance. Maybe you can share your perspective without putting Ava in the spotlight too much." That gave James an idea. He decided to write an open letter, addressing the public and the store directly. In the letter, he described the impact the incident had on his daughter and called for systemic changes to prevent similar situations in the future. He emphasized the importance of treating all customers, especially children, with respect and dignity. When he finished writing, he read the letter aloud to Ava. "Do you think this is okay? Sweetheart, I want to make sure you're comfortable with me sharing this." Ava listened carefully, her small face thoughtful. "It's okay, Daddy," she said. "If it helps other kids, then I think it's good." James felt a surge of pride. His little girl was braver than she realized. He posted the letter online that evening, and within hours, it began to gain traction. People praised James for his thoughtful and powerful words. The store issued another statement, this time committing to concrete changes, including diversity training for all employees and a new policy for handling customer concerns. As the days went by, James and Ava began to adjust to their new reality. While there was still a lot of attention on their story, James made sure to keep things as normal as possible for Ava. They went to the park, worked on her drawings, and spent time together like they always had. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ava turned to her dad. "Daddy, do you think things will really get better?" James put an arm around her shoulders. "I think so, sweetheart. But even if it takes time, we'll keep trying. Because it's worth it." Ava nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I want to help too. Maybe one day I can draw something that shows people how to be kinder." James smiled, his heart swelling with love and pride. "You already make the world better, Ava, just by being you." As the stars began to appear in the night sky, James felt a sense of hope. The road ahead might still be challenging, but he knew they would face it together. The weeks following the incident were a whirlwind for James and Ava. Though life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, there were still reminders of how their story had impacted the world around them. James tried his best to keep Ava shielded from the intensity of the attention, focusing on their everyday routine, school, chores, and their cherished father-daughter time. But change, it seemed, was inevitable. One day, James received an email from the store's corporate headquarters. The subject line read, "An invitation to discuss change." Intrigued, he opened it. The email was from a senior executive, expressing deep regret over the situation and inviting James to a meeting. They wanted to hear his ideas on how they could improve their policies and training programs. James felt a surge of both skepticism and cautious optimism. This could be an opportunity to make a real difference, but he needed to be sure they were sincere. After discussing it with his sister, who had been his steadfast sounding board throughout this journey, James decided to accept the invitation. On the day of the meeting, he put on his best shirt and tie, clothes he rarely wore since leaving his corporate job, and headed downtown. He left Ava with her aunt, explaining only that he had an important meeting to help make things better. When James arrived at the sleek office building, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. He was ushered into a large conference room where a group of executives, including the CEO, were waiting. They greeted him warmly, offering him coffee and water, but James kept his focus sharp. He wasn't there for pleasantries. The CEO began by apologizing once again, this time in person. "Mr. Taylor, we are deeply sorry for what happened to your daughter. We've realized this incident reflects a broader issue, and we're committed to making meaningful changes. We'd like your input on how we can do better." James listened carefully, then spoke with clarity and conviction. He shared his thoughts on the need for better employee training, not just a one-time session, but an ongoing effort to educate staff on bias and empathy. He also suggested creating a more transparent complaints process, where customers could report issues without fear of being dismissed. The executives took notes, nodding as James spoke. By the end of the meeting, they promised to implement several of his recommendations and to keep him updated on their progress. As James left the office, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. While he couldn't erase what had happened to Ava, he felt he had done something to ensure it wouldn't happen to another child. He hoped their words would translate into actions, but only time would tell. Meanwhile, Ava was adjusting to her new reality in her own way. At school, some of her classmates had heard about what had happened. A few were curious and asked questions, while others simply treated her the same as they always had. But there was one girl, Emma, who had been particularly kind. She had shared her crayons with Ava during art class and even invited her to play during recess. Ava, who had been feeling a little out of place since the incident, was grateful for Emma's friendship. One afternoon, as James picked Ava up from school, she excitedly told him about a project they were working on in class. "We're drawing pictures about what kindness means," she said, holding up a sketch she had started. It showed two figures, one small and one tall, standing side by side, with a rainbow arching above them. James felt his heart swell. Ava's ability to find beauty and hope in the world, even after everything she had been through, never ceased to amaze him. As the months passed, the changes James had fought for began to take shape. The store announced a new customer care initiative, complete with revamped training sessions and a hotline for addressing complaints. They even invited James to speak at one of their employee workshops. Though he initially hesitated, he ultimately agreed, knowing that sharing his story could help others understand the importance of compassion and fairness. On the day of the workshop, James stood in front of a room full of employees, some of whom looked uncomfortable, others genuinely engaged. He spoke from the heart, recounting the events that had unfolded and the impact they had on his daughter. By the time he finished, there was a quiet but palpable shift in the room. A few employees approached him afterward, thanking him for sharing his story and promising to do better. Back at home, life slowly returned to normal. James and Ava spent their weekends at the park, reading books and working on her art projects. Ava's drawing about kindness was chosen to be displayed at her school's art fair, a moment that filled James with pride. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Ava turned to James. "Daddy, do you think we helped people learn to be nicer?" James looked at her, his heart full. "I think we did, sweetheart. And even if it helps just one person, it's worth it." Ava smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You're the best, Daddy." James hugged her tightly, feeling a deep sense of peace. The journey had been unexpected and at times difficult, but it had also brought them closer together. In the face of adversity, they had found strength, not just in themselves, but in the kindness and support of others. And that, James thought, was a lesson worth holding on to.